Imagine this. You are brilliant. You have read the books, traced the philosophy, mapped the psychology of your own suffering with almost surgical precision. You understand, perhaps better than most people around you, exactly why you are the way you are. You can articulate your wounds with the vocabulary of Carl Jung. You can diagnose your patterns with the clinical calm of a therapist. You can explain, in elegant and compelling detail, every reason why your life has not yet become what you know it could be. And yet, nothing changes. The years accumulate, the plans remain unstarted, the conversations you rehearsed in your mind never happen. The work you were always about to begin sits in the same state of permanent potential, gathering the quiet dust of postponement. You are not lazy, you are not ignorant, you are not even afraid, or at least that is what you have told yourself with increasing sophistication. You are simply thinking it through. You are being responsible, careful, measured. But here's the question that cuts through all of it like a blade. What if your thinking is not preparing you for life? What if it is replacing it? Today, we will explore this uncomfortable idea through the lens of Dostoevsky, psychology, and human behavior. And near the end of this journey, we will reveal the most powerful and unsettling realization of all, the one that changes how you see your own mind. Stay with this until the end, because the final insight is the most important one. This channel exists for those who are drawn to deep reflection, to the timeless wisdom of philosophers, psychologists, and thinkers who dared to look honestly at human nature. Here we explore ideas not to feel smarter, but to live more consciously. If you value this kind of exploration, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment with your thoughts. What we uncovered today may change how you understand yourself and the world. Fyodor Dostoevsky was obsessed with the contradiction at the heart of the human being. He understood that intelligence does not automatically lead to action, and that self-awareness does not guarantee transformation. In fact, he often showed the opposite. In works like Notes from Underground, he presented a narrator who is hyper-conscious, painfully intelligent, and utterly incapable of decisive action. This man thinks endlessly about his own flaws, the cruelty of society, the absurdity of morality, the hypocrisy of others, and yet he remains inactive, resentful, and deeply alone. This is not a comfortable question. It is the kind that arrives uninvited at 3 in the morning when the noise of distraction finally dies and you are left alone with the unnerving suspicion that something has gone deeply, quietly wrong. Not in the world around you, not in your circumstances, but inside the very instrument you have trusted most, your mind. Dostoevsky spent his entire literary life orbiting this terrifying possibility. He was not interested in weak characters who lacked intelligence. He was obsessed with something far more disturbing, the brilliant person who uses that very intelligence against themselves, the person whose consciousness, rather than illuminating a path forward, becomes the maze they can never escape. In The Underground Man, he gave this figure a voice, raw, unbearable, painfully recognizable, a narrator so self-aware that he has become paralyzed by that awareness, so capable of analysis that he has lost the capacity for living. The Underground Man is not a caricature of failure, he is a portrait, and the unsettling truth is that the longer you sit with him, the more familiar his voice begins to sound. We live in an age that worships cognition. Intelligence is currency. Reflection is virtue. The person who pauses, who deliberates, who thinks before acting, they are held up as the ideal against the reckless, impulsive masses. We are told that awareness is the beginning of transformation, that understanding yourself is the first step toward changing yourself. And there is truth in that, but only a fraction of the truth, because somewhere in the translation, a dangerous confusion took root. The map was mistaken for the territory. The preparation was mistaken for the journey. The act of understanding was mistaken for the act of living. And so an entire generation of deeply thoughtful people finds itself in an exquisitely articulate form of stasis. Consider what this actually looks like, not in theory, but in the texture of real days. It looks like another notebook filled with plans that never leave the page, another year of consuming wisdom about courage without demonstrating any, another relationship left unspoken because the timing was never perfect enough, another version of yourself perpetually arriving, perpetually almost ready, perpetually about to begin. The brilliant mind becomes a courtroom in which every impulse is prosecuted, every desire cross-examined, every dream found guilty of insufficiency before it ever meets reality. What is this if not a sophisticated prison? And here is where Dostoevsky's genius becomes almost unbearable in its precision, because he understood that the person living inside this prison does not feel imprisoned. They feel elevated. They feel that their refusal to act carelessly, their demand for perfect conditions, their endless internal deliberation, these things distinguish them. They are not stuck. They are thorough. They are not afraid. They are wise. But Dostoevsky strips that comfort away. He shows us with devastating clarity that awareness without action does not refine a person. It corrodes them. The mind that turns perpetually inward, that never converts its understanding into movement, does not become more enlightened. It becomes more tormented, more isolated, more contemptuous of itself and the world it has refused to enter. So ask yourself, and ask it honestly, without the armor of another explanation, how much of what you call thinking is actually a form of hiding? How much of your self-reflection is genuine growth, and how much is simply the mind's most sophisticated way of staying exactly where it is, untouched by risk, by failure, by the terrifying and irreplaceable experience of actually trying? These are not rhetorical provocations. They are the questions Dostoevsky embedded into every page he wrote, and they demand something more than another careful, well-reasoned answer. They demand that you feel the weight of what it costs to keep thinking and never move.
The mind does not choose rationalization by accident. It chooses it because rationalization feels safe. Action exposes us to uncertainty, to judgment, to the raw and humbling possibility of failure. Thought, on the other hand, offers something that feels like control. When we think, we remain sovereign. Nothing external can harm us there. No outcome can surprise us. No risk can humiliate us. And so the mind, ever faithful to its primary instinct of self-preservation, learns to prefer the territory of explanation over the wilderness of experience. Dostoevsky understood this with the intuition of a novelist and the precision of a psychologist. Rationalization, he showed us, does not begin as cowardice. It begins as a wound. A person acts once, vulnerably, hopefully, and fails. They feel the sting of that failure, the exposure of it, the way it seems to confirm every quiet fear they held about themselves. And instead of enduring that pain long enough to learn from it, the mind adapts. It learns to delay. It learns to construct. It learns to build narratives so refined, so internally consistent, that inaction begins to wear the face of virtue. I am not afraid. I am cautious. I am not avoiding responsibility. I am waiting for clarity. I am not stuck. I am preparing. Over time, these justifications become indistinguishable from wisdom. They are delivered in the same tone, with the same vocabulary, with the same air of hard-won maturity. And that is precisely what makes them so dangerous, because unlike obvious avoidance, the kind that even the person practicing it can recognize, rationalization is invisible from the inside. It does not feel like a defense. It feels like discernment. Sigmund Freud identified rationalization as one of the ego's most sophisticated defense mechanisms. Its function is elegant and cruel in equal measure. It protects the self-image by offering the conscious mind an acceptable explanation for what is, beneath the surface, an unacceptable feeling. The real motive, fear, shame, the terror of being truly seen and found wanting, is buried. In its place, a reasonable-sounding substitute is installed. The person genuinely believes their own explanation. That is not hypocrisy. That is the architecture of the defended self. Carl Jung extended this further. He warned that when consciousness becomes inflated, when a person over-identifies with their intellect, when they begin to treat the capacity for thought as their defining feature and highest achievement, they sever themselves from what he called the instinctive vitality of the psyche. They lose contact with the living, breathing, desiring creature underneath the analysis. They become, in a word, dissociated, present to their own thinking, but absent from their own life. This is the portrait Dostoevsky renders in The Underground Man with such devastating accuracy. The narrator does not simply fail to act, he takes pride in his failure. He believes that his excessive consciousness elevates him above the ordinary people who move through the world with what he dismisses as primitive, unreflective impulse. They act, yes, but they act without understanding. He understands everything, and in his mind, that understanding is its own superior form of existence. But Dostoevsky will not let him have that comfort unchallenged, because the reader watches with growing unease as the underground man's superiority curdles into resentment. His philosophical detachment hardens into bitterness. His intelligence, so meticulously cultivated, so genuinely formidable, produces not wisdom, but isolation, not peace, but a torment so refined that it has become almost ornamental. He suffers brilliantly, and he changes nothing. Jean-Paul Sartre, decades later, would give this condition a different name: bad faith, the refusal to acknowledge one's own freedom, the retreat into determinism, into the comfortable story that circumstances or temperament or the complexity of the situation make action impossible. Bad faith is not lying to others, it is lying to oneself about the nature of one's own agency. And Sartre, like Dostoevsky before him, understood that this lie is never passive. It is chosen. It requires maintenance. It demands constant intellectual labor to keep the illusion of inevitability intact. Look honestly at how this manifests in the world today. The person who consumes years of content about productivity but never begins the project. The one who has read every book on relationships but remains unwilling to risk genuine vulnerability with another person. The one who understands with remarkable clarity every psychological reason for their own stagnation and uses that understanding as the final, most sophisticated reason not to move. Society quietly rewards this. The thinker is admired. The one who hesitates is called responsible. The person who says, "I'm still processing," is met with patience and respect. And all the while, the silent cost accumulates, not dramatically, not in a single moment of obvious collapse, but in the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of a life that was always about to begin. Ask yourself this, and let it sit uncomfortably for a moment. When was the last time you used understanding as a substitute for courage? When did insight step in to replace movement? When did you tell yourself you were thinking something through when what you were really doing was thinking yourself out of it? Because if rationalization is the mind's most elegant trap, then self-awareness, the very tool we believe will save us, can become its most sophisticated bait. And that realization opens a door into something darker still.
There is a particular kind of suffering that leaves no visible marks.
It does not announce itself with dramatic collapse or obvious crisis. It does not arrive in a single moment you can point to and say, that is where things went wrong. Instead, it accumulates the way sediment does at the bottom of still water, quietly, incrementally, until one day the water is no longer clear and you can no longer remember when it stopped being so. This is what happens to the person who thinks but never acts. Not a sudden unraveling, but a slow and almost elegant disappearance from their own ambitions, from their own relationships, from the living texture of their own existence. And the most devastating part is that they are often the last to see it, because from the inside, it does not feel like disappearance. It feels like deliberation. Dostoevsky understood this trajectory with a precision that neuroscience would only begin to confirm a century later. The underground man does not suffer despite his intelligence. He suffers because of how he has deployed it. Every cycle of analysis that ends without action does not simply leave things unchanged. It reinforces the pattern. The neural pathways of avoidance deepen. The habit of substituting thought for movement becomes more automatic, more invisible, more deeply woven into the fabric of how the person meets reality. What began as a conscious choice to delay gradually becomes an unconscious reflex. The mind no longer asks whether to act. It simply reaches, by default, for another layer of thinking. Modern neuroscience has a name for this process. It is called learned helplessness, a condition first documented by psychologist Martin Seligman, in which repeated experiences of perceived ineffectiveness teach the nervous system to stop attempting change. But there is a subtler, more insidious version of this that Dostoevsky had already mapped in literary form. It is not helplessness born from repeated failure. It is helplessness born from never having tried at all, from a pattern of perpetual preparation that keeps the person permanently insulated from the feedback of real experience. The result is a psyche that has lost its confidence, not through defeat, but through the slow atrophy of never being tested. And what does that atrophy feel like from the inside? It feels like increasing self-contempt. It feels like the specific and grinding misery of knowing what you should do and watching yourself not do it, day after day, year after year, until the gap between the person you are and the person you believe you could be becomes so wide that crossing it seems not merely difficult, but cosmically absurd. The underground man lives in this gap. It is his permanent address. And Dostoevsky shows us that no amount of intelligence, no depth of self-knowledge makes that gap more bearable. In fact, the more clearly you can see it, the more it burns. Søren Kierkegaard, whose philosophical anguish rhymes with Dostoevsky's literary one in ways that feel almost conspiratorial, warned that reflection becomes despair the moment it is severed from commitment. He argued that the self is not a fixed thing waiting to be discovered through sufficient introspection. The self is something that must be built, constructed through choice, through risk, through the willingness to bind oneself to a path and accept responsibility for where it leads. To refuse this, to remain permanently in the mode of consideration, of weighing, of almost deciding, is not neutrality. It is, in Kierkegaard's framework, a form of slow self-annihilation. This is the unseen consequence that rarely appears in any honest accounting of the cost of overthinking. We talk about missed opportunities as though they are external losses, doors that closed, chances that expired. But the deeper damage is interior. Every time the mind rehearses an action and the body does not follow, something in the person's sense of their own agency quietly diminishes. They begin, almost imperceptibly, to stop trusting themselves, not because they have failed, but because they have repeatedly demonstrated to themselves that their intentions and their actions inhabit entirely different worlds. And a person who does not trust themselves cannot move freely.
every potential step becomes encumbered by the accumulated weight of all the steps that were considered but never taken. There is also a social dimension to this that deserves examination. The person in permanent deliberation does not only disappear from their own life, they become increasingly unreachable to the people around them. Genuine intimacy requires presence, and presence requires a willingness to be seen in motion, in error, in the undignified and imperfect reality of actually doing things. The overthinker, armored in analysis, remains perpetually one step removed. They can discuss connection with extraordinary sophistication. They can diagnose the dynamics of every relationship they have ever had with clinical precision. But the moment genuine vulnerability is required, the moment the situation demands not insight but showing up, the familiar retreat begins. Another layer of thinking, another reason to wait. Viktor Frankl, writing from the wreckage of his experience in Nazi concentration camps, observed that those who survived the unsurvivable were rarely those with the most elaborate internal philosophies. They were those who found something specific and concrete to commit to, a person to return to, a task to complete, a meaning to embody through action, rather than simply contemplate in thought. Frankl's insight cuts directly against the fantasy of the overthinker, that meaning is something you arrive at through sufficient reflection. It is not. Meaning is something you generate through engagement, through commitment, through the irreplaceable act of bringing yourself into contact with the world and letting that contact reshape you. The tragedy of the person who thinks but never acts is not that they lack the capacity for meaning, it is that they have convinced themselves that they are pursuing it, while every habit of mind they have cultivated is quietly ensuring they never reach it. And so the question that must now be faced is not a gentle one. It does not permit the comfort of further analysis. It simply asks, how long are you willing to remain a spectator of your own potential? How many more years will you spend preparing to live the life that is already, right now, slipping past you? Because the trap has been named, the mechanism has been exposed, and knowing this, truly knowing it, not as an interesting idea, but as a personal reckoning, changes the nature of what comes next.
Everything you've been told about change is backwards. You've been told that clarity comes before commitment, that confidence precedes action, that you must first resolve the internal conflict, silence the doubt, achieve some stable and settled sense of self, and then, from that solid ground, you may finally begin to move. It sounds reasonable. It sounds mature. It is, in the most precise sense of the word, a lie. And it is a lie so perfectly constructed that it masquerades as wisdom, so widely accepted that questioning it feels almost irresponsible. But here is what Dostoevsky understood, what Kierkegaard insisted upon, what every person who has ever genuinely transformed their life has had to discover for themselves, usually the hard way. You do not think your way into a new way of living. You live your way into a new way of thinking. This is the rebellion. Not a rebellion against reason. Reason is not the enemy here. The rebellion is against the tyranny of reason operating without limits. Reason elevated to the position of absolute sovereign over a life it was never designed to govern alone. The mind is a magnificent instrument, but an instrument is not a master. And the moment you hand your mind total authority over when and whether you are permitted to act, you have not made yourself safer, you have made yourself a prisoner of your own intelligence. Kierkegaard called this the leap. Not a leap of blind irrationality, not the abandonment of thought, but the willingness to move despite the unresolved questions, to step forward into genuine uncertainty and trust that the ground will reveal itself beneath your feet rather than needing to be guaranteed in advance.
He watched the thinkers of his era drown in reflection, perpetually circling the edge of commitment without ever jumping, and he named what they were doing with devastating clarity. They were using thought as a substitute for existence. They were, in the most literal philosophical sense, failing to be. The counterintuitive truth that breaks the spell of rationalization is this: motivation does not precede action, it follows it. The person who waits to feel ready, to feel inspired, to feel the internal alignment of certainty and desire before they begin, that person is waiting for something that the architecture of the human mind almost never produces on demand. Readiness is not a feeling that arrives, it is a feeling that is built, constructed through the accumulated evidence of small actions taken, small commitments honored, small risks survived. You do not become courageous by thinking about courage. You become courageous by doing the thing that frightens you and discovering on the other side of it that you are still standing. Consider the historical figures who broke free from exactly this trap. Albert Camus, who understood the absurdity of the human condition as clearly as any person who has ever lived, did not respond to that absurdity with paralysis. He responded with rebellion, with the insistence on creating meaning through engagement, rather than waiting for meaning to be delivered through understanding. He wrote, he acted, he committed, not because the questions were answered, but because he grasped that the questions would never be answered, and that waiting for them to be was itself the abdication of the only freedom available to us. William James, the father of American psychology, arrived at perhaps the most practically revolutionary insight on this subject: act as if. Not as a form of self-deception, but as a recognition of the profound and underestimated relationship between behavior and identity. James observed that we do not act according to who we are so much as we become who we repeatedly act as. The person who acts with courage, even while feeling afraid, is not being false. They are being generative. They are using behavior to construct the very character trait they believed had to exist before the behavior was possible. Dostoevsky's own life embodied this truth in the most extreme possible terms. He faced a mock execution, survived 4 years of imprisonment in Siberia, endured epilepsy, devastating debt, and the deaths of people he loved, and through it all, he wrote. Not because the conditions were right, not because the suffering had been processed into clean and manageable understanding, but because the act of writing itself was how he metabolized existence, how he converted the raw and overwhelming material of his experience into something that could illuminate the lives of others. He did not wait to be healed before he created. He created as a form of healing. The action was not the reward for having resolved the inner conflict. The action was the resolution. This is the radical shift that the person trapped in overthinking must eventually make. The shift from asking, "Am I ready?" to asking, "What is the smallest true thing I can do right now?" Not the perfect action, not the comprehensive plan, not the fully formed version of the life you have been designing in your mind for years, just the next small, honest, slightly uncomfortable step. One conversation that has been postponed, one page written, one decision made and committed to without waiting for the anxiety to subside first. Because here is what that small action does that no amount of thinking can replicate. It returns you to the realm of consequence. It places you back inside the living feedback loop of reality, where things happen, where you discover what you are actually capable of, where your identity is no longer a theoretical construct, but a demonstrated fact. An identity that is demonstrated, even imperfectly, even awkwardly, even in ways that require revision, is infinitely more powerful than identity that is only ever imagined. The underground man's tragedy is not that he thinks, it is that he has made thinking the whole of his existence, and in doing so, he has exiled himself from the only place where the questions he circles endlessly can ever be genuinely answered, not in the mind, but in the lived, imperfect, irreplaceable texture of a life actually being lived. The rebellion, then, is not dramatic. It does not require a grand gesture or a total reinvention. It requires only this: the willingness to act before you feel ready, to move before the path is certain, to step into the discomfort of genuine engagement with your own life and trust, not blindly, but based on every piece of evidence that Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, Camus, and James and the whole weight of human experience is offering you, that the person you are capable of becoming is waiting not inside another layer of thought, but on the other side of a single, imperfect, courageous action. The question is no longer whether you understand the trap. You do. You have always understood it. The question, the only question that has ever mattered, is whether you are finally willing to leave it.
There is a moment that arrives for some people, not loudly, not with the drama of revelation, but quietly, almost without warning, when they realize that the life they have been preparing to live is their life, that the waiting was not a pause before the story began. The waiting was the story, and the pages are already filled. This is the moment Dostoevsky was always writing toward. Every tormented monologue of the underground man, every circle of brilliant and suffocating self-analysis, every paragraph in which intelligence devours itself rather than directing itself outward, all of it was building toward this single, shattering recognition that freedom is not found at the end of enough thinking. Freedom is found in the act of commitment. And commitment, by its very nature, cannot be reached through thought alone. It requires the one thing the overthinking mind has been most desperately trying to avoid: the willingness to be wrong. Consider what it actually means to keep all your options open. It feels like freedom. It presents itself as sophistication, the refusal to be limited, the insistence on remaining fluid, adaptable, uncommitted to anything that might later prove to have been the wrong choice. But look at what this posture actually produces over time. Not freedom. Not the expansive, luminous life of infinite possibility. Instead, a life of perpetual potential that never crystallizes into anything real. A life that remains always in the subjunctive tense: what could be, what might happen, what you would do if only the conditions were right. Dostoevsky understood that this is not freedom. This is its precise opposite. Real freedom, the kind that generates meaning, that builds identity, that makes a person feel genuinely alive rather than merely thoughtful, is born through limitation, through the act of choosing this over all other possibilities and accepting the weight of that choice, through the willingness to say, I do not know if this is perfect, I do not know if I am ready, I do not know how it will end, and I am going to do it anyway. Because the alternative, remaining suspended indefinitely in the safety of the unchosen life, is a cost I am no longer willing to pay. This is what Dostoevsky meant when he showed us the underground man not as a figure of pity, but as a warning. The warning is not about intelligence. It is not about sensitivity or depth of feeling. It is about what happens when a person's most powerful faculties are turned entirely inward and never allowed to meet the resistance of the real world. The underground man is not destroyed by his enemies or his circumstances. He is destroyed by the one force he never learned to direct outward: himself. And here the realization deepens into something almost unbearable in its simplicity. The final illusion,
the one that sits beneath all the other illusions, the bedrock upon which the entire architecture of rationalization is constructed, is this: that you must first become the person you want to be before you can begin to act like them. That transformation is a prerequisite for movement rather than its product. That somewhere inside you, waiting to be unlocked through sufficient self-understanding, is the complete and finished version of yourself, confident, certain, unafraid, and once you reach them, then the life can begin. Dostoevsky tears this illusion apart with the quiet ferocity of a man who has suffered enough to know better. You do not become someone else and then act. You act, and in acting, you become. Identity is not a prerequisite for movement, it is its consequence. The person you are is not a fixed entity waiting to be discovered. It is a living process, shaped by every choice you make and every choice you refuse to make. And the choice to remain in permanent preparation, however intelligently, however philosophically justified, is itself shaping you into someone more distant from life, more armored against vulnerability, more fluent in the language of why not, and more silent in the language of yes. Modern psychology confirms what Dostoevsky rendered as lived, bleeding truth. Behavioral activation, the clinical principle that action precedes and generates motivation rather than following it, is now one of the most evidence-supported principles in the treatment of depression and anxiety. The mind in distress tells the person to wait until they feel better before engaging with life. The evidence says the opposite. Engagement with life is what generates feeling better. You do not wait for the fog to clear before you move. You move, and the moving is what clears the fog. But there is one final layer here, the one Dostoevsky himself would insist upon, the one that separates genuine transformation from merely replacing one sophisticated idea with another. Because even this, even the call to action, even the insight that motivation follows movement, can be absorbed by the overthinking mind and converted into another concept to be admired rather than embodied. The mind is that agile, that relentless, that capable of turning even the truth into a refuge. The real turning point is not intellectual, it is existential. It is the moment when a person stops relating to their own life as a problem to be solved and begins relating to it as a responsibility to be carried. When they stop asking what the right action is and start asking who they are willing to become through action. When the question shifts from, "Am I ready?" which the mind will never answer with a yes, to, "What do I owe to the life I have been given?" Responsibility, in this sense, is not a burden, it is a liberation. Because the moment you accept that your life is genuinely, irrevocably yours to shape, that no amount of further thinking will make the path appear, that no perfect moment of readiness is waiting just beyond the next layer of reflection, something releases. The paralysis does not disappear immediately. The fear does not vanish, but they lose their authority. They become weather rather than walls, conditions to be moved through rather than problems to be solved before movement is permitted. Dostoevsky believed, and his entire body of work is the extended argument for this belief, that human beings are defined not by what they understand, but by what they choose when understanding fails them. Reason can map the territory, it cannot make you walk it. Philosophy can illuminate the stakes, it cannot make the commitment for you. And self-awareness, however deep, however hard-won, however genuinely illuminating, it can bring you to the edge. It cannot take the step. That is yours alone. So let this be the thought that remains when everything else fades, not as another idea to be filed away alongside all the other insights that have accumulated without changing anything, but as a reckoning a quiet, serious, personal reckoning with the only question that has ever truly mattered. You have been thinking. You have been understanding. You have been, in your most honest moments, aware of exactly what is happening and exactly what it is costing you. The mind has done its work. It has mapped the prison with extraordinary precision. Now comes the only thing it was never able to do for you. The door has always been open. It was open the moment you began to see it clearly. The only question, the final question, the one Dostoevsky leaves hanging in the silence after the last page is turned, is not whether you are ready to walk through it. It is whether you are finally willing to stop asking if you are ready, and simply, at last, move.